Thank you, Lorenzo. There's certainly a Jewish tradition that follows also from Spinoza. Maybe you will talk a bit about it. People looking at juxtaposing Jerusalem to Rome and Athens and others coming to this day. And our commentator is Eyal Chowers from this university, from the Political Science Department, and his recent book, also from Oxford University Press, is The Political Philosophy of Zionism, Trading Jewish Words of an Hebraic Land. So,
thank you. I found the paper very rich and interesting, and it's very tempting as a political theorist to question and get into a discussion about the specific interpretations of some of the theorists, Machiavelli, Hobbes, etc. But I will resist this temptation and try to make a few comments about the general ideas of the paper, which I'm not sure if it's a paper or really a sketch for a book, because it seems to me so rich from Dante to contemporary Europe that only a book can cover it, I think, in the way it deserves, and I hope you will do that. So you said here some things that are not in the paper, and especially I was glad to hear your comment about the need for a normative dimension for grounding authority. You said it in one sentence. In the paper it doesn't appear, or maybe I missed it. And I hope to get into a discussion about that, and I want to raise a question first in this regard. Let me quote something that you write on page 15. You write, in a world where global relations are increasingly more important, a state that is regarded as a strong collaborative player will increase its power of action. To this extent, the obligations of state can be grounded on the state's very interest, rather than on more or less legal vague moral notions. Let me read it again. To this extent, the obligations of state can be grounded on the state's very interest, rather than on more or less vague moral notions. And then on page 16, you write, a naturalistic explanation of the state presents obligations toward other actors as being grounded not on moral concerns, but on the self-interest in preservation and flourishing of the state itself. A state has power insofar that it is capable to survive, but loses that power as soon as it is no longer capable to do that. Its right to rule is coextensive to its power. Now, I find these sentences a bit problematic, and let me tell you why. You're right that since Machiavelli, we see a kind of separation between the sphere of morality and the sphere of power, the sphere of the state. And it's a constant theme in political theory. It's associated mainly with reason of state tradition, raison d'etat, and we see that as a growing force, and maybe the point where it's getting into the most extreme expression is in Max Weber, where Max Weber see in his theory of the value spheres in modernity, you see a complete separation between the sphere of morality and the sphere of power. And Weber, to those of you who don't know, he separates between 6 spheres that characterize modernity: sphere of the economic sphere, capitalism; the sphere of power, the sphere of the state; the moral sphere, the artistic, the erotic, and the cultural one. Each one of these spheres has a certain principle that shapes this sphere, and through history, this principle becomes more and more dominant and more expressed. The moral sphere becomes more and more demanding, more and more universalistic, more centered on intentions. And the political sphere becomes more centered on power, the accumulation of power, more centered on the self-interest of the state, more aloof from concern to other states or for moral considerations generally, and more preoccupied with the prestige and the preservation of both the culture and the people of the state. Now, to write something like that in the beginning of the 20th century is problematic, to be sure. I mean, as Weber did, but it's much more problematic to embrace this kind of thinking today. And after what we have seen in the 20th century and the very horrendous consequences of separating morality from politics, or saying that the normative dimension of our life doesn't have a very dominant role in shaping the political sphere, I think that any attempt to separate them becomes something that we have to be very careful. And I think, Lorenzo, that you may have to grapple with this question, whether you're doing that, and if you're doing it, what are the implications? I think there are two questions that you're not exactly separating. One question is whether the state is a necessary feature of politics. Maybe we can think about other forms of organizing ourselves politically, and I agree with you. We could, and maybe we should at one point. And the second question is whether we should separate the moral from the political and the normative from this political, the feature that we have today, the state. And I think this is dangerous. So I think my first point is the separation should be questioned. My second point is, and you mentioned it also in your talk, but you didn't mention it in the paper, is what does it mean to speak about the demise of the state in this context here? We have borders with Syria, and as you mentioned, Iraq and Lebanon and other failed states. And it seems that this paper is a bit Eurocentric in the sense that you can imagine that the state maybe is not necessary. And maybe we're moving to a world where the state will be, as you suggested, but it's a very European notion. And it's because Europe has been able to develop alternative institutions, the EU, the courts, and a very strong notion of citizenship, which you don't mention citizenship. Now, the state and citizenship has been developing hand by hand in European thought and practice. And because they have been developing in such a way, and we have such an accomplished notion of citizenship in Europe, there are other forms that are able to guard this notion of citizenship and accomplish other tasks that you talk about, such coordination of trade and so on. But if we didn't have this state and we didn't have the developed notion of citizenship through the institutions of the state, I'm not sure that we could have gotten to where we are today in Europe. Now, it seems that here we have a very different situation where in the Middle East, the state did not develop as a strong institution for various reasons. And this citizenship did not develop as a strong concept and practice and is not grounded in law in the way that we would have liked to. So my question to you is, do we live in the same time? On the one hand, we all read the news at the same time. We see the same television, whether we are in Iraq or in London. But on the other hand, we live in a very different historical times. And my question is whether you think we need to pass, I'm talking as a Middle Eastern, do we need to pass through a certain phase of having a state and having a strong notion of citizenship before we can begin to think about the demise of the state? Or do you think it's something that we can skip? Because it seems to me that right now we have a world where we can begin to imagine the demise of a state, and a world where people just crave for a state in order to stop them from killing one another. And my last point is about this place. You're saying that if we think naturalistic about politics and about state authority and the notion of sovereignty, maybe you can do it without grounding, without any ideas about what legitimizes state authority. And it reminded me about discussion that we had in our department. Sorry, I'm entering politics of political departments. And my department is composed 70% of people who have all kinds of statistics and graphs and that I can never understand. And they are saying in this room we had a discussion about who we should recruit for our department, and faculty says, well, political theory is completely marginal subject. It's not important. It always has been marginal. And we should go on with where political science is going today. And I kind of say, just a minute. I mean, we are here in Israel, which is based on ideas, based on a few books that have been written in the late 19th century. It's all composed of imagination. It's the imagination of words of people that created this place. And here we are today speaking Hebrew and saying that actually ideas don't shape politics. So I'm asking you the same question. I mean, this is a place that has been established in virtues of ideas. And the whole institution of the state, the whole institution called Israeli state is based on certain notions of moral ideas and ideas of nationalism, the ideas of justice among nations, living what's happening today. And could we explain this phenomena called the Israeli state without having a very strong notion of ideas and the grounding that these ideas gave to this state? So I just wonder. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.